Welcome to the first topic of advanced nutrition, which is the cell. We're going to start with this basic structure because it's really the place of a lot of nutrition activity, specifically metabolism. So when we think about nutrition, as we go through this class, we're going to talk about things in a little bit different way. So I kind of wanted to start out by thinking about sort of this macro versus micro viewpoint, specifically to the cell this week. So you've learned about the cell in previous coursework, but I really want to think about some aspects of cell structure and function that are important in nutrition. So nutrition's an interesting science because we often think about it on a somewhat macro or systems level. So we think about kind of the whole body, which is absolutely important. But a lot of the intricacies of nutrition happen on a cellular or molecular level, which is really kind of what I think of as more the micro level, if we want to think about it that way. So another way to say this, when we think about nutrition, we often think about things like weight management or the prevention of chronic diseases and those types of things. So I would think about those as fairly macro issues, sort of large scale systems issues. And quite frankly, I think that's often what really matters to people. But when we study the science of nutrition, we start to look at the detailed mechanisms or the micro issues, if you will, that lead to those macro or systems issues that we really care about, like prevention of chronic disease, weight management, those types of things. I often think of this as really sort of zooming in and zooming out as we look at different biological functions. So we can think about big issues such as weight control, and then we can also start to sort of zoom in, if you want to think about it that way, to think about what happens on a cellular or molecular level that contributes to weight regulation. It gets pretty complex because in most cases, I would say we don't have a lot of clear, detailed answers. But by starting to look at some of the cellular and molecular activities that contribute to health and disease, we can really start to think about potential areas that we can target for treatment and or prevention. So in this class, we'll often focus a lot on microfactors, so cellular, molecular, or biochemical types of factors. It's sort of tempting to view these aspects in isolation because they really do start to get pretty complex and they have a lot of different interactions. But I would really caution us all to remember that although it can be beneficial to look at things on this micro level, as we will in this class, humans function really on a macro level with all parts of the system interacting. So once we have an understanding of a particular aspect of the micro level, so as we look at cellular, molecular types of levels of things, we need to also then kind of zoom back out to the macro level to see how things function as a whole system. Because again, that's really what happens in humans. So let's talk a little bit about cell structure. This is a schematic of a basic eukaryotic cell structure. There are many similar schematics, and these basic organelles and cell structure is something you've learned since basic biology. So nothing on here should be new to you, but I want to dive into this a little bit and sort of have it at the forefront of your mind as we move forward. So I think it's easy to look at this image and kind of think, you know, check, check, check. I know all these parts of the cell. I'm good to go. So I hope that's in fact true, that you do know the parts of the cell, or at least they look familiar and you can remember when you look at them. But I also want you to stop and really think about how cells make up the human body. So our bodies are made up of trillions of cells. A quick Google search told me 30 trillion cells, which actually doesn't account for the bacteria that reside in us, which have all of their own cells, but that's a whole other topic that we won't look at. So bottom line is we have trillions and trillions of cells within our body. The schematic on the screen gives us a very elementary look at the structure of a cell, but it's important to remember that our cells are infinitely more complex than this would suggest. Certain functions happen in nearly all cells in the human body, and then there are many functions that are actually specialized to one particular type of cell. For example, we really understand intuitively that our myocytes, or muscle cells, function differently than neurons, or nerve cells. But how does this happen, and what does that really have to do with nutrition? Well, let's start by kind of thinking about some of the functions that are nearly the same in all cells that have important nutrition implications. So we'll start here with some of the common cell functions. So first of all, most cells in the human body, again, have some functions that are similar at a basic level. One of those functions is cellular transport. So cells need to control what goes in and what goes out of the cell. For nearly all substances, there has to be some sort of control of how much is actually allowed to go in the cell. And a lot of that has to do with maintaining homeostasis and integrity of the cell and all of those types of things. But there needs to be some type of control. We'll look in a moment in a little more detail at this when we look at cell membranes, which really serve as the gatekeeper, so to speak, of what goes in and what goes out of the cell. So another function of cells is energy production for the cell. So often when we think about energy in terms of nutrition, we really associate it with calories, which is accurate to do, but sometimes we forget that this energy needs to happen on a cellular level. So each cell needs energy to do whatever work that particular cell does. For some cell types, like muscle cells, for example, we typically recognize that as an energy need. So we think about muscle cells making and needing energy. But other cell types, we might not think about it so much as needing energy to function. But every cell has to have energy to do whatever it is that that cell does. The primary site of energy production within the cell is in the mitochondria. So we'll look specifically at that also. A third function that has significant implications in terms of nutrition is communication between the inside of the cell and the external environment. Again, remember that the inside of the cell is where the work really happens that allows the body to function. So metabolic factors, those types of things when we think about nutrition. But the extracellular environment, so the outside of the cell, is where all the information really lies that needs to be communicated to the inside of the cell in order to trigger the appropriate processes. So we'll look at that a bit as well. The final aspect on this slide listed here of cell functions is cellular replication. So this happens in many cells, but not all cells, not all cell types replicate. One example here is epithelial cells, which are cells which essentially separate the inside of the body from the outside world. So for example, cells inside the intestinal tract would be one example of an epithelial cell. Epithelial cells regularly die and continually replicate to make new cells. We'll review this idea a bit when we cover genetics, but in terms of cell structure, this is where we remember that the nucleus of the cell contains the DNA, which is needed for cell replication. So again, this is just one of those common cell functions. Now we'll shift a little bit to look at each of these common functions in a bit more detail and think about some of the nutrition implications that come into play. Here is another sort of classic cartoons of a cell membrane. Again, certainly you've learned these parts of the cell membrane before, such as the phospholipid bilayer that has the hydrophilic heads facing out into the aqueous environment, and the hydrophilic tails facing in and away from the water contained in the extracellular fluid and the cytoplasm. You probably also remember that there are integral proteins, which span the entire width of the cell membrane, and there are peripheral proteins that are only on the surface of the cell membrane. So in this schematic here, you see some of the peripheral proteins here, some of the integral or membrane proteins, and oops, here we go, integral proteins spanning the whole cell membrane. So within the cell membrane, I want to highlight a few key areas and concepts. The first thing to really keep in mind is that although we often look at these really static pictures, the cell membrane is really anything but static. It's actually quite dynamic and very fluid. For example, the general proteins you see listed here, so it kind of has a globular protein and, as we mentioned, the integral protein and those kinds of things that show it just as an example. They sort of look on the image like they would be in that place at all times. But actually, these proteins can actually move around in the cell membrane. So they can move laterally in the cell membrane, and they can actually move into and out of the cell membrane, which we'll look at an example of that in a minute. So these proteins can be used as transporters, for example, that can move things in and out of the membrane as they are needed or not needed. The cell membrane is also not symmetrical, so it can be different dimensions throughout the cell, and the inside and the outside of the membrane is not the same. So this is where the side that faces the extracellular fluid, and this is the side of the cell membrane that's facing the cytoplasm or the inside of the cell, and these are asymmetrical. Another component that I want to remind you that is really a key part of cell membranes is cholesterol. So cholesterol plays a key role in giving the cell membrane structure and helping it maintain some rigidity. So although cholesterol sometimes gets sort of a bad rap, it's absolutely essential for healthy cell membranes. Glycoproteins are also, I kind of wrote over them here, but glycoproteins are also found in cell membranes, and they're molecules that are comprised of a carbohydrate and a protein. There's sort of this, as I mentioned, the generic glycoprotein shown in this image, but again, remember that those would be unique for different cells. Glycoproteins often serve as one of the compounds that facilitate communication from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. So that communication aspect between the extracellular space and the inside of the cell is really critical because it tells the cell what sort of work needs to happen or what needs to be done inside the cell. So we'll look at one example of that. This is one example of how a cell membrane, I think it illustrates some of the aspects of how that cell membrane is really dynamic and plays a key role in the regulation of cell function or what's happening in the cell and the response of the inside of the cell to the external environment. So we'll look at glucose transporter 4 or GLUT4 as one example here. GLUT4 is one of the proteins which transports glucose into the cells. We'll look at a variety of glucose transporters when we cover carbohydrates, but we'll use this specific one as an example here. So GLUT4 is primarily active in muscle and cardiac cells, but it also has activity in other cell types such as adipocytes or fat cells and white blood cells. So if we look, for example, at a muscle cell, GLUT4 actually resides inside the cell in vesicles in the cell's basal state. So right here we see the vesicle, it's pointing to this purple thing as the GLUT4 storage vesicle, and then you see GLUT4 illustrated with this little green compound here or schematic in this picture. So in a basal state, when the cell doesn't necessarily need glucose, such as at rest, the GLUT4 transporter stays really within the cell in that vesicle. However, when there's some type of communication from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell that tells the cell that glucose needs to come into the cell in order to produce energy, what happens is this vesicle, which is shown in purple here, moves up to the cell membrane, and you can see here, again, this is a very elementary drawing, but kind of gives you the idea that that GLUT4 moves actually into the membrane, or the vesicle moves up to the membrane so the GLUT4 can become part of a membrane. It's an integral membrane protein, so it spans the whole membrane and then allows these glucose molecules to enter the cell. So the glucose molecules are shown by these little yellow dots in this image here. So then once there's no longer a need for additional glucose in the cell, the GLUT4 actually then returns to its storage vesicle within the cell. Another aspect of the cell structure that gets involved here is the cytoskeleton. So when we saw the cell membrane picture, there was pictures of the cytoskeleton. And again, in pictures, sometimes it looks very static, but the cytoskeleton actually restructures in order to allow movement, in this case of the GLUT4 storage vesicle, to the membrane for the translocation of GLUT4 into the membrane. So there's lots of activity that happens to get that GLUT4 up to the cell membrane when glucose needs to come into the cell. And when we don't need more glucose in the cell, then that GLUT4 goes back into its storage vesicle. Let's back up for just a minute and look at another piece of this picture. So we also talked about one common cellular function being communication between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. So in this situation, you can see in this image that insulin was a part of that communication process. So here we see insulin with the red dots, and the insulin receptor, again, another protein in the cell membrane, is shown by this little blue image. So when insulin binds to the insulin receptor, that triggers a series of reaction that signals the GLUT4 storage vesicle to move up to the surface or translocate. You could do a quick Google search on insulin signaling cascade, and you'll really see the complexity of everything that happens in order for that communication to happen. So again, here we're showing very simply that the insulin binds to the receptor, the GLUT4 storage vesicle is triggered to move up to the cell surface, which is shown over here. GLUT4 integrates into the cell membrane and transports glucose in. However, in reality, if you look up the whole signaling cascade, this part over here has a huge number of reactions that are triggered in order for that to happen. But bottom line being, this insulin is triggering this response that's going to allow the GLUT4 to move and transport the glucose in. So this is really critical in nutrition because it often can be nutritional factors that trigger the signaling cascade. So in this case, that insulin signaling cascade triggered by probably an elevated amount of glucose, could also be something like exercise or something that's that's telling the muscle cell that there needs to be more glucose in there. But often there's something nutritionally related on the outside of the cell that triggers the cell to do some sort of activity. So in this example, we saw insulin as that trigger, but really even before that, it was glucose, elevated glucose level again, or exercise, something that triggered that release of insulin. So the body senses either the excess glucose in the blood or the inadequate glucose in the cell for whatever work the cell needs to do, and then it releases insulin, which starts the signaling cascade, which then allows glucose to enter the cell. So again, I'm just using examples, and I'll do this often throughout this class that we'll use an example to illustrate a concept. But the important things here are thinking about how the cell and the cell membrane is really a place that communication happens between the inside and the outside of the cell, and it's extremely fluid and dynamic based on whatever needs to happen. So proteins really come around over and over again, that they provide critical functions in cells. We already talked a bit about the role of proteins as receptors and as transporters. And another really key function of proteins is to function as enzymes. So we'll look a bit at enzymes as well because they have a lot of nutritional implications. Enzymatic activity within the cell really, again, is a significant area of nutrition interest. You've learned about enzymes, but I think they warrant thinking about again because the role of enzymes come up regularly in nutrition. You know that an enzyme is a protein which catalyzes a reaction, so it speeds it up or allows it to happen. But the enzyme doesn't get used up or really altered in that process. So that's kind of the definition of an enzyme that you're familiar with. I like the image on this slide as a way of looking at enzymes because it shows both the more simplistic view over here on the left that we often see in books or whatever about enzymes, but then it also gives an image on the right that begins to illustrate, still a cartoon image, but begins to illustrate or help us think a little bit about the complexity of enzymes, or really any protein. So remember, enzymes are proteins. And proteins are very complex structures, much more complex than carbohydrates or fat. So if you look at the very simplistic view on the left, you remember that enzymes are made to fit specific substrates. So in this case, it kind of shows you these two places in the enzyme that have a place that the substrate is going to enter and bind, which is shown here where you have the protein or the enzyme substrate complex. So in nutrition, for example, we often think about digestive enzymes. So lactase, for example, is the enzyme that has a space, if you will, that fits the carbohydrate lactose, which allows the lactose to be broken apart into those subunits of glucose and galactose. The glucose and galactose therefore become the products of that reaction. So kind of in remembering terminology, just to refresh your memory, the lactase is the enzyme, the lactose is the substrate, and then the glucose and the galactose are the products of the reaction. So that's really the process of digestion. And again, that's just one example, but we see enzyme activity a lot in digestion. So the image on the right also, I think, reminds us that protein molecules, as I mentioned, just have a very complex structure. They're not as simplistic as what the image on the left would show. And the enzyme is actually thought to follow what's called an induced fit model. So not so much the lock and key model that used to be really used, but more of what's called an induced fit, where the shape of the space that the substrate occupies actually goes through a bit of a conformational change when the substrate's bound, which causes the enzyme and the substrate to bind more tightly. So in other words, they have a higher affinity, and that allows the reaction to continue with less of an ongoing need for energy, or in other words, it stabilizes the reaction. So in this image, you can see here, there's the space here where the substrate's going to bind in the enzyme, so it's showing the substrate out here. And once it comes in and binds, as it shows down here, then this blue is kind of showing you how that where that conformational change is happening. So you kind of see that it's folding around that substrate in order that it stays there tightly and that reaction can continue to happen, as opposed to if it stayed like this top picture, it would be easier for that substrate to disconnect from the enzyme. So it still will be able to disconnect later, and it'll go back to the enzyme being separate from the products. It'll release the products, but it allows that to continue happening. So another concept that, clear that off a little bit there, another concept that I think is important to remember when we talk about nutrition is the saturation of enzymes. So to some extent, there's really a finite number of particular enzymes for a specific function. Now, in reality, that can be upregulated or downregulated to create more or fewer of the enzyme depending on the physiological need. But the point being that there's some physiological maximum of how many of a particular enzyme we can make or have at one time. And this is actually also true of protein transporters. So I want you to remember this idea of saturation. The reason I think that it's a really critical concept in nutrition is because it means if we put more substrate into the body than the enzyme, in this case, or also a transporter would be the same issue, but in this case we're talking about enzymes. If we put more substrate in the body than we have available enzymes, the body simply won't be able to process it. So let's go back again and use lactose and lactase as an example, since I think this one's familiar to a lot of people. So if someone has lactose intolerance, it basically means their body produces a limited amount of lactase. So if we're using this image to say our enzyme here that we're talking about is lactase, and here's our lactose, just, for pretend if we're using it for the example. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they produce no lactase at all. They just produce not enough. So that's why someone with lactose intolerance may be able to tolerate a very small amount of dairy, because in that small quantity, there's still enough of this enzyme to bind, lactase enzyme to bind and accommodate that lactose and handle it. But once they reach a particular threshold where all of the enzyme is saturated with substrate, so all these little openings are full, the body can then no longer digest the lactose, and so then it typically causes GI distress. So again, this is true for transport proteins as well. So if, for example, the transport protein for iron is completely saturated and we keep putting extra iron in the body, it simply can't get into the cells it's needed to because it has no way to enter there. So this idea of saturation, both in transporters and in enzymes, is really important. Okay, so that was kind of a lot for this slide, but some of the key concepts I want you to think about. First, I want you to refresh what you learned about enzyme activity from your basic biology and your biochemistry classes. Then remember that enzymes follow an induced fit model. So even though they're specific to a particular substrate, they do also go through some conformational changes that allow that reaction to continue. And enzymes are proteins, and therefore they are quite complex in their structure. And then also remember that enzymes are saturable. In other words, there's not unlimited capacity for their functionality. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at another key cellular function, which is energy production. So we're going to look at the mitochondria since that is where a lot of this happens. The mitochondria are often referred to as the powerhouse of the cell because this is really where the vast majority of energy production occurs. We'll go into more detail on energy production in later units, but at a basic level, you'll remember from your other coursework that glycolysis, the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle or TCA cycle, all of those are the same thing, and the electron transport chain are the pathways for energy production. So glycolysis is the first step in this reaction, and glycolysis happens in the cytosol, which you'll remember is that aqueous solution that fills the cell. So over on this left side is glycolysis, which ends in the product of pyruvate as sort of the end product of glycolysis. So that happens in the cytosol, and then that pyruvate moves into the mitochondria as shown here. Going right here into mitochondria where the Krebs cycle or TCA cycle or citric acid cycle, whichever you're referring to it as, and the electron transport chain happens. So glycolysis is an anaerobic pathway, but it actually produces very little energy, which is why we really think of the mitochondria as being the place where the vast majority of energy is produced. So the Krebs cycle happens in the mitochondrial matrix, and then the electron transport chain is found in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So that's where most of the energy production happens. So really healthy mitochondria are essential for efficient energy production. You might have heard the term mitochondrial dysfunction. So essentially what that's saying is if mitochondria aren't working as they should be, there's going to be a lack of adequate energy production within that cell, which is going to impair function of that particular cell. Now, some cell types require and therefore produce more energy than others. For example, myocytes, again, muscle cells, are really high users of energy, which makes sense. So they're going to have very active mitochondria, and dysfunction is probably going to have pretty significant consequences, and typically is going to cause something like, fatigue or something like that, weakness, because there's so much activity there. Mitochondrial dysfunction in GI cells might cause something like constipation or diarrhea. So basically, the function of the affected cell is going to determine what the symptoms are if the mitochondria aren't functioning well. So it's going to be different in a muscle cell versus a GI cell versus some other type of cell. Okay. Another cellular concept. So we kind of already looked at a few cell functions that are common to most cell types. One other concept that I want to highlight is the idea of coupled reactions. Again, this is something you've had before, but it's important in nutrition because it relates to energy. So we know that overall, energy can't be created nor can it be destroyed, but we can sort of move it around, so to speak. Essentially, some reactions yield energy or provide energy, sort of, and some require energy. And by coupling these reactions together or having them happen together, then we can facilitate the reactions that require energy. So in this illustration, for example, the body is going to make a polypeptide chain, and it needs energy to do that. So this is an energy requiring reaction. Remember, a polypeptide is going to turn into a protein. So say, for example, that the body needs to make an antibody to fight an infection. Well, the body needs to make that polypeptide chain, which will then form into a protein. And we need energy to do that. That's an energy requiring reaction. So in order to get that energy, some other reaction needs to be coupled with it or paired with it. So in this little illustration, it shows you how glucose is broken down, and we know the breakdown of glucose is also going to yield some ATP, which is our energy currency, so to speak, and that ATP can be broken down to yield, to release that energy so that amino acids can be joined together to form a polypeptide. So these reactions essentially happen together in order to capture that energy from the breakdown of glucose in order to be used to make that polypeptide chain that the body requires at that point in time. Okay, so a quick recap of some key concepts. First of all, the structure of the cell allows the wide range of functions to happen in that cell that need to happen. And although we often use really simplistic cartoons and drawings to illustrate cells and cell parts, that can be helpful to simplify it, but we also need to remember that the reality is that the cells are much more complex, dynamic, fluid. There's lots going on. Another thing is when we think about nutrition, we need to remember that metabolism all happens within the cell. So healthy cellular function is really essential to efficient metabolism. In terms of communication or communication systems, remember that there's communication between the intracellular and extracellular environment, so inside and outside of the cell. So really the information on the outside of the cell needs to be communicated to the inside of the cell to allow things to happen that need to happen. Those extracellular triggers, if we want to call them that, can often be nutrition triggers. So that's why it's really important to remember that nutritionally. For example, again, blood sugar is an example. If blood sugar is high, or if there's a lipoprotein that's needed, those kinds of things can be triggers for things to happen in the cell. Also remember there's a really complex communication within the cell that often involves a huge series of reactions, which are commonly referred to as signaling cascades, and those allow the cell functions really to be set into motion. Finally, remember that cells are far from static structures that just make up our body like building blocks or Legos or something. They're really fluid and dynamic. So as we move forward in this class, and we'll sort of zoom in to the very micro level of things, and then we'll zoom out to the more macro or systems level, we really want to keep in mind that cells are a very busy place for a lot of nutrition activity.